The smoke rose thick and gray from Elias Kern's chimney, while his neighbors huddled around dying fires in the bitter cold. What they called his greatest failure would become the innovation that saved their lives. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of frontier ingenuity inspire you, hit that subscribe button. Tomorrow's tale of wilderness survival is one you won't want to miss. The cabin filled with smoke so quickly that Thomas Kern never had a chance to reach the door. Elias woke to his brother's coughing, violent and desperate, cutting through the winter darkness. He stumbled from his sleeping platform, eyes burning, lungs seizing with each breath. The chimney had failed. Smoke that should have risen through the flue was pouring back into the single-room cabin, thick and choking, turning the air poisonous. Elias found the door by memory, his hands scraping along the log walls. He threw it open, and frigid air rushed in, -30 degrees, cutting through his wool underwear like knives. The inrush of cold air created a backdraft that cleared some of the smoke, but it also revealed the source of the disaster. Their chimney, built the previous spring using standard frontier methods, had cracked. A section of the mud and stone structure had separated from the main body, creating a gap that diverted smoke back into the cabin instead of up and out. Thomas was still inside, still coughing. Elias went back in, crawling low where the air was marginally better, and found his brother collapsed near the cold fireplace. He dragged Thomas outside into the brutal Montana night. The temperature was lethal. Exposed skin would freeze in minutes, but staying inside meant suffocation. Elias pulled Thomas 20 yards from the cabin to a small equipment shed. The structure was unheated, but it had walls and a roof. He wrapped his brother in every blanket and fur he could carry from the main cabin in repeated desperate trips through the smoke. Then he tried to start a fire in the open air, his hands shaking so violently he could barely strike his flint. The fire started, a small, pathetic flame that did almost nothing against the cold. Thomas's breathing had changed. The violent coughing had stopped, replaced by shallow, labored gasps. Smoke inhalation had damaged his lungs. The cold was finishing what the smoke had started. Thomas died as the sun rose on January 12, 1839. He was 32 years old. He had survived 7 winters in the mountains, dodged grizzly bears and hostile encounters, mastered the brutal craft of frontier trapping. He died because a chimney built in 4 days, with mud and fieldstones, had cracked under thermal stress. Elias buried his brother on a hillside 3 days later when the ground thawed enough to dig. He marked the grave with stones and stood there as the wind cut across the Montana landscape. Other trappers in the scattered community offered condolences. Chimney failures happened. Cabins burned. Men died from smoke or cold or both. It was simply part of mountain life, tragic but unavoidable. Elias disagreed. Thomas's death was not inevitable. It was the result of inadequate construction, and inadequate construction could be corrected. Elias finished the trapping season alone, working the beaver streams with mechanical efficiency. Every night in the smoke-damaged cabin, he studied the failed chimney. He examined the crack that had killed his brother, noting how the mud chinking had dried and shrunk, how the fieldstones had shifted under repeated heating and cooling, how the entire structure lacked any engineering principle beyond stacking stones and hoping they stayed together. He talked to other trappers about their chimneys. Most had experienced failures. Cracks were common. Backdrafts happened regularly. The universal response was resignation. Chimneys were temporary structures that required constant maintenance and occasional rebuilding. No one expected them to last more than a few years. This acceptance baffled Elias. Men who could navigate trackless wilderness and survive impossible conditions simply accepted that their shelters were fundamentally flawed. They treated chimney failure as inevitable rather than as a problem with an engineering solution. In May of 1839, Elias packed his furs and rode to St. Louis. The journey took 3 weeks. He sold his pelts for more than $700. Most trappers would spend this money on whiskey and entertainment before returning broke. Elias spent his first 2 days walking through the city studying buildings. St. Louis was transitioning from frontier outpost to permanent city. Brick structures replaced wooden buildings. Stone foundations supported multi-story warehouses. Elias watched construction crews work, noting techniques and materials. He examined chimneys on expensive homes, seeing designs that bore no resemblance to frontier structures. On his third day, he encountered Jakob Reinhardt. The German stonemason was directing chimney construction for a new brewery. Elias watched him work for an hour before approaching. Jakob's chimney was massive, far larger than necessary. The stones were cut precisely and fitted tightly. The structure incorporated features Elias had never seen, including what appeared to be an interior shelf partway up the flue. Jakob, pleased to find someone genuinely interested in his craft, invited him to observe more closely. Over the next week, Elias returned daily. Jakob had trained in Hamburg, where heating technology was far advanced beyond American frontier methods. German winters were brutal, and Germans had spent centuries perfecting efficient building heat. Jakob explained thermal mass, the principle that certain materials could absorb heat and release it slowly over many hours. He demonstrated how graduated construction could create superior strength. He showed Elias how internal baffles could slow smoke passage, forcing heat into the masonry instead of up and out. He discussed expansion and contraction, explaining how temperature changes created structural stress that poorly built chimneys could not withstand. Elias absorbed everything. He purchased paper and made sketches. Jakob critiqued his drawings and suggested improvements. When Elias explained about his brother, Jakob understood. He had lost his own father to a building collapse in Hamburg. He knew what it meant to carry that weight. Before Elias left Street Louis, Jakob gave him final advice: build it stronger than necessary. Nature would test every structure eventually through temperature extremes, weather, and time. Structures built to barely sufficient standards would fail. Structures built with generous safety margins would endure. Elias left in early June with empty saddlebags and a mind full of knowledge. He had purchased specialty tools and iron hardware. The money was gone, but he carried something more valuable back to the mountains. He understood that Thomas's death had been preventable, and he now knew how to prevent it from happening again. Elias returned to the Montana settlement in late July of 1839. The other trappers were preparing for the fall season, repairing equipment, and scouting new territory. Elias announced he would spend the remainder of summer building a new chimney. Several men offered to help him complete the work in a few days. Elias declined. He explained he was building something different, something that would take 8 to 10 weeks. Warren Tate, a veteran trapper who had survived 12 winters in the mountains, laughed. He assumed Elias was joking. No one spent 10 weeks building a chimney. A cabin could be constructed in less time. Elias was not joking. He spent the first week selecting a location 30 yards from his rebuilt cabin, on a slight rise with clear drainage. The position seemed odd. Chimneys were built, attached to cabins, not standing separate. He began digging a pit 4 feet deep and 6 feet square, well below the frost line. He hauled rocks from a nearby creek and filled the bottom with drainage stone. Cyrus Hadley, an older settler who prided himself on practical construction knowledge, watched this foundation work approvingly. At least the young man understood foundations, even if his location choice was peculiar. The foundation work continued for another week. Elias was meticulous, testing each stone's stability before proceeding. He mixed mortar using clay from a deposit 2 miles away, hauling it back in leather bags. The effort required seemed excessive to observers. Warren mentioned to Henry Pickett that grief had made Elias overly cautious. Both agreed he would regret wasting trapping season when winter came. By mid-August, Elias began the main structure with irregular fieldstones gathered from surrounding areas. This seemed reasonable to the watching community. The work was slow, but not alarmingly so. Several trappers had lost chimneys to poor foundations. Perhaps Thomas's death had simply made his brother careful. The structure rose gradually. Elias worked from dawn until dark, 6 days each week. He spoke little, answering questions briefly. The growing chimney base was wide, much wider than standard construction. When it reached 4 feet high, the base was nearly 5 feet square. Warren remarked that Elias was building a chimney for a mansion, not a mountain cabin. As August ended, the irregular fieldstone section reached 6 feet in height. Elias had maintained a slight taper, narrowing the structure gradually. The work quality was solid. Even Cyrus admitted the stonework was competent. The mortar joints were well packed, The structure was plumb and level. Then, in early September, Elias changed his approach. The stones he selected became more uniform. He spent hours with hammer and chisel, shaping each stone before placing it. His pace slowed dramatically. Where he had placed 30 to 40 stones daily, he now placed fewer than 20. Warren noticed immediately. He mentioned it to others. Why shape stones that would work fine naturally? The answer seemed to be that Elias could afford to waste time on unnecessary refinement. Still, the behavior was odd enough to generate conversation. Men began stopping by to watch, offering opinions that Elias acknowledged but ignored. The chimney continued rising, now built with semi-shaped stones fitted more tightly than the irregular base. Its excessive scale and construction time were becoming undeniable. By the third week of September, the middle section of Elias's chimney had reached 10 feet in height. Each stone in this section had been individually shaped. Elias would select a stone, examine it from multiple angles, then spend 30 to 60 minutes with his hammer and chisel, creating flat surfaces on top and bottom. Only then would he fit the stone into place, adjusting the mortar thickness until the piece sat exactly level. Warren Tate stopped pretending politeness. He told Elias directly that the work was excessive. A chimney did not require stone-cutting precision. Elias responded that he was building it the way he thought best. Warren walked away shaking his head. That evening, he told the other trappers that Thomas's death had affected his brother's judgment more severely than anyone had realized. The name Kern's Folly emerged during a card game at Henry Pickett's cabin. Someone asked if Elias had finished his monument yet. Another replied that monuments had purpose, whereas Elias was building a folly, an expensive structure serving no practical function beyond displaying its builder's eccentricity. The name spread quickly. Within days, everyone called it Kern's Folly, usually with affection but sometimes with genuine concern. Elias heard the name but did not acknowledge it. He continued working. October arrived with cold nights and shortened days. Other trappers were out on their lines, taking advantage of prime beaver season. Elias remained at his construction site. He had completed the middle section and was beginning the top tier. This is when the mockery intensified. The stones for the top section were not merely shaped, they were cut to precise rectangular dimensions. Each block was nearly identical to the others, measuring roughly 8 inches high, 12 inches long, and 6 inches deep. Creating these blocks required hours of work per stone. Elias would split larger stones along natural cleavage planes, then spend an entire afternoon with his chisel, creating the final dimensions. Cyrus Hadley watched this work with disbelief. He asked Elias if he understood that winter was approaching. Elias replied that he was aware. Cyrus asked if he planned to eat stones when his food supplies ran out. Elias said he had sufficient provisions. Cyrus gave up. He told Henry later that evening that Elias had lost his mind completely. No. Sane man cut chimney stones with the precision of furniture joinery. The rectangular blocks went up slowly. Elias maintained his daily routine, working regardless of weather. When rain came, he covered his work with canvas and waited. When the sun returned, he resumed. The structure now looked absurd. The irregular base appeared rustic and appropriate. The shaped middle section looked overly careful. The precision-cut top section looked like it belonged on a government building in St. Louis, not on a Montana hillside. By late October, the top section reached 14 feet total height. The chimney towered over Elias's cabin. Its proportions were wrong by every standard of frontier construction. It was too tall, too wide, too carefully built, and represented too much invested time. Warren began calling it Bridger's Fortress sarcastically. Others picked up the name. The structure had become the settlement's primary source of entertainment and conversation. The first week of November brought the modification that transformed community mockery from amused to concerned. Elias began installing wooden poles around his completed chimney. He had cut 6 straight pine logs, each approximately 10 feet long and 8 inches in diameter. He stripped the bark and treated them with pine tar. Then he dug post holes in a circle around the chimney base, each hole 3 feet deep. Warren Tate watched this new development with complete bewilderment. He asked Elias what purpose wooden poles served around a stone chimney. Elias explained they provided lateral stabilization. Warren stared at him. Lateral stabilization for what? The chimney was stone. It was not going anywhere. Elias said the poles would prevent wind damage and accommodate thermal expansion. Warren told him he was building a chimney, not a ship's mast. The comment spread through the settlement immediately. A ship's mast. The comparison was perfect. Elias was treating his chimney like a vertical structure that needed guy wires and support rigging. Henry Pickett came to observe and agreed the resemblance was uncanny. Cyrus Hadley suggested Elias might add sails next. The jokes multiplied. Elias ignored them. He set the poles at an angle, leaning inward toward the chimney. Once all 6 were positioned, he began connecting them to the stone structure. He had brought iron brackets from street, Louis specifically for this purpose. Each bracket was L-shaped, one arm bolting through the pole, the other embedded in the chimney's mortar joints. He installed brackets at 2 heights, creating a cage-like framework. The installation took a full week. When finished, the chimney stood enclosed by angled wooden poles connected with horizontal cross bracing. The visual effect was extraordinary. What had been an oversized but recognizable chimney now looked like some kind of siege engine or industrial apparatus. It resembled nothing anyone had seen in frontier construction. Rachel Tate, Warren's wife, asked Elias, privately, if he was well. She had known Thomas and understood grief could manifest in strange ways. She suggested gently that perhaps he was working too hard, focusing too intensely on a project that had grown beyond reasonable bounds. Elias thanked her for her concern and said he was fine. He was simply building something that would work properly. Martin Drury, whose cabin was across the clearing from Elias's construction, told others he was genuinely worried. The amount of time and resources Elias had invested was substantial. If the chimney failed to function after all this work, the psychological impact might be severe. Several men agreed. They discussed intervening but decided against it. Elias was a grown man. He had the right to waste his own time and money. By mid-November, the anchor pole system was complete. Elias announced he would conduct the first fire test within days. The settlement waited with mixed anticipation and dread. Some hoped it would work, if only to justify the absurd effort. Others expected catastrophic failure. Warren Tate privately bet Henry Pickett that the chimney would smoke so badly Elias would have to dismantle it. Henry declined the wager, saying it felt wrong to profit from another man's foolishness. November 18, 1839. Elias loaded wood into the massive firebox he had constructed at the chimney's base. The opening was 4 feet wide and 3 feet tall, large enough to accommodate logs that would burn for hours. He had built the firebox with fire brick he had carried from Street Louis, another detail that had prompted head-shaking from observers. Who used fire brick in the wilderness? Warren Tate, Henry Pickett, Cyrus Hadley, and several others gathered to watch. They stood at a respectful distance, unsure what to expect. Elias arranged kindling and struck his flint. The fire caught quickly. Small flames grew, consuming the kindling and spreading to larger pieces. Within 10 minutes, a substantial fire burned, inside the firebox. Elias added larger logs. The smoke began rising almost immediately. It climbed through the interior of the chimney and emerged from the top opening in a thick gray column. The smoke was dense and clearly visible against the November sky. It rose steadily, not rushing but flowing in a continuous stream. The watchers exchanged glances. Warren broke the silence. "It smokes," Henry nodded. "Smokes considerably." Cyrus walked closer, studying the smoke's behavior. "That's worse than my chimney. All that work, and it's worse." Elias continued tending the fire, adding logs systematically. He did not respond to the comments. The smoke continued pouring from the top. After 20 minutes, the smoke showed no sign of diminishing. If anything, it seemed thicker as the fire reached full intensity. "I knew it," Warren said, not bothering to lower his voice. "All that precision, stonework, and fancy bracing, and the damn thing smokes like a green wood fire. Should have built it." "Normal," Henry agreed. 2 days of work would have given him a chimney that worked just as well. Better, probably. At least a normal chimney draws clear once the fire's hot. More settlers arrived, drawn by word that Elias was testing his creation. They stood in a growing semicircle, watching smoke rise from Kern's Folly. The consensus formed quickly. The chimney was a failure. Beautiful stonework, certainly. Impressive engineering effort, undoubtedly. But it did not function properly. A chimney's primary purpose was to exhaust smoke cleanly. This chimney was producing smoke like a signal fire. Martin Drury felt genuine sympathy. He approached Elias and said quietly that perhaps some modification to the interior might improve the draw. Elias thanked him but said no modification was needed. Martin looked at the smoking chimney and said nothing more. Rachel Tate brought Elias coffee and cornbread, a gesture of kindness. She did not comment on the smoke. Elias accepted the food, gratefully, and continued his work. The fire burned hot now, consuming logs rapidly. The stone structure showed no signs of stress or cracking, which was at least a positive result. But the smoke continued unabated. By afternoon, most observers had left. The spectacle had grown boring. Elias's chimney smoked. That was the story. Warren told anyone who would listen that he had predicted exactly this outcome. 10 weeks of work for a chimney that performed worse than standard construction. Kern's folly, indeed. October turned to November, and November brought the first serious cold. Temperatures dropped to 10 degrees at night, cold enough to make cabin life uncomfortable, but not yet dangerous. Every trapper knew this was merely a warning. The real cold would come in December and January, when temperatures could fall to 30 or 40 below zero and stay there for weeks. Elias burned fires in his smoking chimney each evening. The smoke continued rising thick and gray, visible across the settlement. He seemed unconcerned by this. He tended his fire for 4 to 6 hours each evening, then let it die to coals before sleeping. His cabin, connected to the massive chimney by a stone corridor he had built, stayed warm through the night. Other trappers maintained their fires differently. Standard frontier practice required keeping fires burning continuously during cold weather. Men woke multiple times each night to add wood, preventing their cabins from becoming dangerously cold. This was accepted as necessary. Fires that died meant frozen cabins by morning. Warren Tate mentioned to Henry that at least Elias could afford to waste wood with that massive firebox. Henry agreed. The amount of wood Elias burned each evening would last a normal cabin 2 days. Of course, with a chimney that smoked away half the heat, he probably needed the extra fuel just to stay comfortable. Late November brought a cold snap, 5 days where temperatures never rose above zero. Night temperatures dropped to -20. This was genuinely dangerous cold. Exposed skin froze in minutes. Cabins became desperate battles against the temperature. Men burned wood constantly, stoked fires every few hours, and still woke shivering. Elias maintained his routine. He burned his evening fire, large logs producing intense heat for 6 hours. Then he let the fire die completely and went to sleep. Warren noticed this and mentioned it to Cyrus. How was Elias staying warm with no fire overnight? Perhaps he had extra blankets, or perhaps he was simply tougher than he looked. The truth emerged accidentally. Martin Drury was checking his trap lines before dawn and passed near Elias's cabin. He noticed something odd. Heat was radiating from the massive chimney structure. Not slight warmth, but substantial, noticeable heat. He could feel it from 10 feet away. The stone was warm to the touch. This was 6 hours after Elias's fire had died. Martin mentioned this to Henry later that morning. Henry was skeptical. Stone did not stay hot for 6 hours. Martin insisted he had felt it himself. That afternoon, Henry walked past Elias's chimney. He held his hand near the stone. It was warm. Not hot enough to burn, but noticeably warmer than the surrounding air temperature. The entire massive structure was radiating heat, Henry told Warren. Warren dismissed it as impossible. Stone cooled quickly once fire died. Everyone knew this. Henry suggested Warren check for himself. Warren refused, saying he had no interest in validating Elias's wasteful construction. But the seed of doubt had been planted. The cold snap continued. Men burned through firewood supplies at alarming rates. Gathering more wood in -20 temperatures was brutal, dangerous work. Yet it was necessary. Fires could not be allowed to die. December 4th, 1839. Martin Drury woke at 3 in the morning to find his cabin interior coated with frost. His fire had died, despite his efforts to maintain it. The temperature inside was barely above freezing. He tried to restart the fire quickly, but his hands shook so violently from cold he could barely manage the flint. When sparks finally caught, he heard a sharp crack from above. His chimney had split. A vertical crack ran from the roofline down to the firebox. Cold air poured through the gap. The chimney would not draw properly. Smoke began filling the cabin. Martin grabbed his wife and 2 children and evacuated into the pre-dawn darkness. The temperature outside was minus 30 degrees. They made it to Warren Tate's cabin, 200 yards away. Warren took them in immediately, stoking his fire and offering blankets. His cabin, built for 2 people, now housed 6. The single small fireplace struggled to heat the space adequately. Everyone was cold, despite being indoors. Warren kept the fire burning hot, consuming wood at an unsustainable rate. By midday, Warren's firewood supply was half depleted. He would need to cut more soon, but going outside in this cold for extended periods was dangerous. Martin felt guilty for the burden his family represented. Warren told him not to worry, though his expression showed strain. That afternoon, Rachel suggested they check if any other cabins might have space. She mentioned that Elias's cabin was empty. He had left 2 days earlier to check distant trap lines and would not return for another day. Perhaps they could shelter there temporarily. Martin was reluctant. Elias's chimney was a known failure, smoking terribly. But Rachel pointed out that an empty cabin was still shelter, and anything was better than overcrowding Warren's home. They walked across the settlement to Elias's cabin. The massive chimney stood silent, no smoke rising. The fire had been out for at least 40 hours. Martin opened the cabin door and felt warmth wash over him. The interior was not hot, but it was comfortable, perhaps 50 degrees. Far warmer than outside, warmer even than Warren's. Overcrowded cabin. He stepped inside, confused. There was no fire. The firebox held only cold ash. Yet the cabin was warm. He walked to the stone corridor connecting the cabin to the chimney structure. Heat radiated from the stones. The entire massive chimney was warm to the touch. 40 hours after the last fire had died, it was still releasing heat. Martin stood there, hand against the warm stone, understanding dawning slowly. The smoking chimney was not a failure. The smoke visibility meant heat was being captured, not wasted. The massive stone structure was not excessive. It was a heat storage system. The weeks of careful construction, the graduated stone sections, the anchor poles accommodating thermal expansion, all of it served a purpose Martin had not comprehended. He returned to Warren's cabin and explained what he had found. Warren did not believe him. They would have to see it themselves. December 7th brought temperatures of minus 35 degrees. The cold settled over the Montana settlement like a physical weight. Every cabin fought a desperate battle against the temperature. Fires burned constantly. Men exhausted themselves gathering and splitting wood. Children huddled under furs. The cold was relentless and life-threatening. Warren Tate's firewood supply was nearly gone. 3 days of housing Martin's family had depleted reserves that should have lasted 2 weeks. He needed to cut more, but doing so in this temperature was dangerous. Henry Pickett faced similar problems. Cyrus Hadley had burned through his November supply and was cutting into wood he had planned to save for January. That afternoon, Rachel Tate made a decision. She walked to Elias's chimney, which stood silent in the center of the settlement. She approached cautiously and placed her hand against the stone. It was warm. Not slightly warm, but noticeably, substantially warm. She walked around the structure. Every side radiated heat. The massive chimney was functioning as a heating source, even with no active fire. She returned home and told Warren. He was skeptical, but desperate. His family was cold despite a roaring fire. They walked together to the chimney. Warren touched the stone and felt warmth that his own cabin walls, 3 feet from an active fire, could not match. He stood there silently, understanding, reshaping his assessment of everything he had witnessed over the past 3 months. By evening, word had spread. Families began gathering near Elias's chimney. They stood in groups, warming themselves against the stone. The radiant heat extended 15 feet from the structure. People who had been shivering in their own cabins felt comfortable standing in the open air beside this massive stone monument. Children played near it. the first outdoor activity in days. Martin Drury's family had been sleeping in Elias's cabin since their chimney failure. Martin now understood fully what he was experiencing. The cabin stayed comfortable all day and night, with no fire. The stone structure released heat slowly, constantly, maintaining livable temperatures for over 2 days after the fire died. His own cabin, even with a working chimney and continuous fire, had never stayed this comfortable. Elias returned that evening from his trap lines. He found half the settlement gathered around his chimney. People made way as he approached. Their expressions changed from 3 months earlier. There was no mockery now. Warren stepped forward. "I need to know how it works." Elias looked at the gathered families, at the cold, desperate faces, at people seeking warmth from a structure they had called folly. He explained simply. The visible smoke was heat being extracted into the stone. The massive size was necessary for heat storage. The graduated construction accommodated thermal stress. The anchor poles prevented expansion damage. The system was designed to capture and slowly release heat, turning one evening fire into 2 days of warmth. Warren listened, then asked, "Can you help me build one?" Rachel added, "Can you teach all of us?" Elias nodded, yes. Spring of 1840 brought construction activity unlike anything the Montana settlement had seen. Warren Tate began building his chimney in March, with Elias supervising every step. The work took 9 weeks, matching Elias's timeline. Warren no longer considered this excessive. He understood now that each week of construction would return years of efficient heating. Henry Pickett started his foundation in April. Martin Drury, whose family had survived the worst of winter in Elias's cabin, began in May. By summer's end, 4 new chimneys stood in various stages of completion. Each followed Elias's design: irregular fieldstone base, shaped middle section, precision-cut top tier, wooden anchor poles. The settlement's appearance had transformed. The following winter proved the system's value definitively. Families using Kern-style chimneys burned 60% less firewood than those with traditional designs. Men spent less time in dangerous cold-cutting wood. Children stayed warmer and healthier. The communal gathering around the large chimneys created social cohesion the isolated settlement had previously lacked. Word spread beyond the immediate area. Trappers from other regions visited to see the unusual structures. Some mocked them initially, repeating the same objections Warren and Cyrus had voiced. But those who spent a winter nearby became converts. By 1842, Kern-style chimneys were appearing throughout the northern Rockies. Variations emerged as builders adapted the design to local materials, but the core principles remained: massive thermal mass, graduated construction, heat retention over heat loss. Elias trained others in the construction techniques Jakob Reinhardt had taught him. He shared freely, asking nothing in return. Some men offered payment. Elias refused. The knowledge had saved his community. That was sufficient. He returned to trapping, running his lines each season, living quietly. The massive chimney that had made him famous required almost no maintenance. The stone remained solid. The anchor poles weathered but held. The system functioned exactly as designed. The Montana Territory changed through the 1850s. The fur trade declined. Settlers replaced trappers. Small communities became towns, but the chimneys remained, repurposed for new inhabitants. Homesteaders discovered the abandoned structures and recognized their value immediately. Buildings were constructed around chimneys rather than chimneys being added to buildings. The thermal efficiency reduced heating costs substantially, a significant advantage for families establishing new farms. Elias Kern died in March of 1867 at age 53. He had outlived his brother by 28 years. He was buried beside Thomas on the hillside, overlooking the settlement that had become a town. His gravestone listed his name, dates, and nothing more. But his legacy stood throughout the territory in stone and mortar. The chimney Elias built in 1839 continued functioning into the 20th century. New owners maintained it, recognizing its superior design. The anchor poles were replaced twice. The mortar was repointed once. But the stone structure remained sound, still capturing heat, still radiating warmth, still proving that what the community had called overkill was simply engineering done properly. The smoking chimney that saved a settlement stood as testament to one man's refusal to accept that his brother's death had been inevitable.